Welcome everyone to another episode of Becoming Ourselves. We have a special guest today, Stephanie Simpson. Stephanie is an artist, coach, facilitator, speaker, and the author of 21 Day Stress Management Workbook, a holistic interactive guide to redefining your relationship to stress. Very cool. Drawing on her background in movement, meditation, trauma-informed practices, and psychology, she partners with people and businesses and organizations to achieve their greatest potential by nurturing the connection between the mind, body, and spirit. Skilled at holding space so that people and businesses get clear on their purpose and align with their purpose with their goals, Stephanie empowers her clients to live courageously and to be to the fullest by creating trauma-informed communities and workplace cultures that are human-centric, fostering and valuing employee wellness and sustainability. An RYT 200-hour certified yoga instructor, Stephanie holds a BA in interdisciplinary studies from Emerson College and a Master of Fine Arts in Dance, Performance, and Choreography from Smith College, a Master's of Arts in Clinical Psychology with an emphasis in spirituality, mind, body, and a focus in organizational change from Columbia University Teachers College. What a well-educated person. This is impressive stuff.
Truly.
Her research focuses on fear and stress management, conscious leadership, group development, peak performance, and creativity/innovation. She is an ICF certified professional coach at the PCC level and a master practitioner in the Energy Leadership Index assessment. Stephanie works with individuals, groups, and teams in a variety of industries: finance, education, technology, media and arts, healthcare, and startup entrepreneurship. Recent clients and partnerships include Paramount Global, Accepted, Maven Clinic, General Assembly, Medley, Riverdale Country School, and Walton, Lantaff, Schroeder, and Carson LLP. Stephanie has been a guest on many podcasts, now Becoming Ourselves, was a freelance meditation writer for the Shine app, a contributing expert for Her Campus Media, and has been published on several virtual platforms including Thrive Global, Authority Magazine, Elephant Journal, and Body, Mind, Love. Stephanie, thank you so much for being here. This is
Thank you
so
for
exciting.
having me.
Yes, we can't wait. So Stephanie, before we kind of jump into some of the prepared questions that we have, you have dabbled in a lot of different things. You have a very wide and varied background, which is very exciting, very interesting. One of the reasons that I wanted to bring you on as a guest is that you've done a lot of things. In Morning Brew, our connection, we talk a lot about range, and that there's huge value in drawing from different backgrounds and different industries and different fields to be able to bring that kind of diverse background into figuring out what you want to do next and then being great at it. Can you talk a little bit about where you're at now and how this diverse background and how all of your different degrees and certifications kind of play into what you're working on?
Yeah. So what comes to mind first is that I really do live my life by like, what am I curious about? And then following that curiosity. And so when I think about all the different things I've done, and it was funny, I was just having a conversation with someone today about this, who's looking to transition out of one industry into another. I was saying I spent a lot of time, I would say probably like 5 or 6 years ago, thinking about my North Star statement. So some people call it like a brand statement, or like a company would be like a mission statement. And for me, sometimes those words don't resonate. For me, they feel like too corporate like. And so I was like, well, what's my North Star? And what I feel like a North Star statement does is it gives me a compass to be able to say, okay, how do I say yes and no to different things? Well, how does it align with this statement? Though it also can be outward facing. And a lot of the feedback I was getting as I continued to build my company and like what I'm doing was people were like, oh, so you just keep reinventing yourself, or how did you get from this and this? And to me, they're all the same thing because I'm doing the same things in all those spaces. It just looks slightly different. So I created a North Star statement, which is I create and hold safe spaces to help people understand themselves more deeply so that they can connect with others and the world around them in more meaningful ways. And so I always say I'm in the business of helping people to understand what it means to be a human themselves so they can connect with other human beings. It just looks outwardly different, whether I'm teaching a dance class or directing a show or choreographing a new piece, or if I'm going into, a law firm and doing a whole workshop on stress management, or I'm working with an entrepreneur and we're navigating like, what's your strategy? What's your vision? It all starts with the person and them being able to understand who they are, what they want, and how to align that to then grow into this bigger vision. So that was one of the first things not the first thing, that was something I did after following all these like curiosities and being like, I see all these overlaps and connections, like connecting these different dots, but how can I make sense of it for myself so that it will also make sense for other people?
I love that. I love that. And I think like in that North Star statement, like it doesn't say anything about like you're a yoga instructor or like you work in the fine arts or anything like that. Like it's bigger than that. Like it's kind of the mission that drives all of those things. And I think that that it probably is very helpful to have something that's like a concrete statement like that you're able to use as a North Star to like navigate through your life.
Yes, because it can get really overwhelming because I am curious about different things and I'm like, oh, what about this? What about this? What about this? And then I can feel overwhelmed by like, oh, there's so many things. And then having to come back and go, okay, which of these is really in alignment with what I want to be working towards, also this North Star statement. And so it also helps me to feel more confident saying no to things as well.
I bet that's so helpful because like I think even I have been maybe a victim of victim is the wrong word, but I've fallen prey to like that entrepreneurial ADD where it's like that, oh, there's so many things that are interesting, there's so many things that I want to try, and so I'll just try them all, and then spending 45 minutes a week on a dozen different projects like doesn't really get any of them anywhere, and instead it's been very helpful in the last like year or two to be able to say like, no, these are the things that I want to focus on, and maybe not forever, but for this season, these are the things that I'm going to really invest in instead of kind of the let's pretend to work on all of these things. Let's actually work on one of them.
Yeah, that actually really resonates right now for certain things in my life.
I really like how you also opened that with like what am I curious about, because so I just recently graduated college and so much of college is like some of it's really great and you like love the classes that you're really interested in, and then a lot of it is taking learning and being spoon-fed things that you like aren't interested in, and it's so much harder to learn. And I think one of the really great things about my recent influx of free time is realizing like, oh, I don't feel like bogged down diving into something I'm curious about because I like want to learn more about it. And I think that's such a good outlook on everything to say, yeah, curiosity is what drives passion and what drives learning in a much more effective way than like a restrictive learning style. And I think you've done a good job as well with kind of your North Star statement of building out some discipline in that curiosity, but also leaning into that curiosity to become your authentic self in some sense, right?
Yeah.
Really cool stuff.
What really came up for me as you were saying that is like really the artist mindset. There's a really great book called Free Play, which is about like improvisation in art and life. And I revisit that book every so often. And what I love about it is this idea that we actually don't hit a flow state, and flow state is another whole theory too. But like, in a flow state, we're actually in an optimal state, an optimal performance. And to live this optimal life, part of that is to learn how to play. And when we're playing, there isn't a necessary outcome, right? It is just the act of playing. But that curiosity is what starts that play, right? And then as soon as we turn it into like a game, or like what is success, it no longer is play because we've put conditions onto it, right? And so how many things do we do in our life where we really allow ourselves to be curious and play without there having to be some sort of outcome? And as I'm saying this, I think about my own things that I'm doing where I'm like, sometimes I do get too tunnel focused where I'm like, how is this going to like shift my bottom line, right? Or how is this going to attract more clients or things like that? But it takes out literally the fun of it. And then that's where we also get to that place of stress and overwhelm, which is where a lot of like my interest lies and my research lies. And it's like, how can we come back to that place of play? Because if we're really invested in that way, it's also more sustainable.
Right. Joel and I talk a lot about on this podcast about like how sometimes putting too many goals or milestones or key performance indicators in place can make it such a daunting reality that you're up against. And I like kind of inputting play into that idea of, yeah, if you're just like having fun for the sake of having fun, you can do great things and you can achieve incredible things without focusing on that final, well, I'm working toward this. No, sometimes you're just doing fun things and amazing things happen. Yep. Especially I think art brings that out of just like incredibly creative, incredibly beautiful things happen because somebody was just living into their authentic self.
And then bringing in like the yoga philosophy is non-attachment, right? So what's challenging at times, especially as being a coach, and that's where I do most of my work now, is like it is about forward movement and creating goals and things like that, or working with businesses. And right, we can say like KPIs and OKRs and all these like acronyms that we love to throw around, and attaching right? And attaching an outcome to that, right? And measuring success based on that outcome, that also creates a lot of unnecessary stress and overwhelm and constricts creativity, because people don't want to like try new things because they are afraid that if it doesn't work and it doesn't align with like meeting the goal at a certain point and what success is measured by, they don't do it, right? But then we always say we want to have like innovation and creativity and all that, but we're not actually creating systems or teams or places allowing for that to happen. And so in the yoga philosophy, it isn't about not having goals to work towards. But it's about not attaching to whether those goals are successful or not, right? So when I'm working with clients, a lot of times I'll say things like, okay, what are we working towards? And it's really interesting. A lot of people have a hard time putting a goal, like articulating a goal. And then maybe they'll articulate something and I'll say, great, how are you going to measure that? And then that becomes like I don't know, how do I measure that? Like something that somebody will say like, I just want to feel more confident about things. Great. Okay. That's a great goal. But how are you going to measure that you are, right? Like, how will you know that you feel more confident down the line than you do now? But if we give like a time to it, because that's where accountability comes in. So time is something like that. It doesn't necessarily mean that if in 2 months you don't hit what you measured as being more confident, that doesn't mean you failed at it, right? So then that becomes this like growth mindset, like sort of thing. It's like, what did I learn from that? And I feel like that's where the goal setting thing and attaching to it and constricting things is we don't allow ourselves to play. We don't allow ourselves the space to reflect and to see that maybe we didn't hit the ultimate goal right then, but we did grow, right? We did shift. And that right there is really, in my mind, the ultimate goal is that we're continuing to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah. It almost makes me think like setting a goal and getting moving, like getting movement happening. Well, you might not even move in that direction, but movement is what we are often going for, and stretching and growing. Well, cool. I had an idea that I was going way to the right. I ended up going to the left, but I'm in a different spot than I started. I wasn't stagnant, and I did grow.
Yeah. I love that. So we did like a whole episode talking about like goals and values and systems and all of that, like earlier in the show. And one of the things that we talked about is, and this like links with some other ideas, but the idea that when you set a goal, like a simple example from this podcast, like the goal of we're going to get 10,000 downloads on this show, that like until we get 10,000 downloads on the show, like we are in a state of we haven't reached it. Like we're in a state of incompleteness, a state of dissatisfaction, a state of like yearning for that goal that we're not there until we've hit that. And then as soon as we hit that, we set another goal. And then we put ourselves back in this state of not being there, of this state of dissatisfaction. And we have talked a lot about like Epicureanism on this podcast, about like the idea of like we want to care for our resting state, like we want to be in a tranquil resting state is what we've talked about with that. And I like that idea of non-attachment, that the goal isn't necessarily the problem, but the problem is like attaching our self-worth or our value or anything like that. Attaching that to that goal leads to all these things that are frustrating about goals and that are the bad thing. It's not that trying to get, again, 10,000 downloads on a podcast, that's not a bad thing. But if my self-worth is tied up in that, if the value of doing this podcast is tied up in that, then it's a miss. Like then that's what becomes the problem. That's what becomes challenging and negative about this goal that can be a driving factor otherwise.
Perfectly said. I can't agree more. Because that is exactly what happens, right? And as humans, it's kind of the way that we've been conditioned, right? And talking about school and how like schools are structured, like that's exactly how we've been conditioned for how as many years as you went through school, was that like, here's the goal. Like literally you're given a syllabus in college and it's like, here are the objectives. Here's how I'm going to assess you. And here's how like you can get an A, B, C, D, or how you fail. Right. And like, of course we're going to then start attaching ourselves to like how well we did there, because then we get taught that like, well, how well you do in school is then going to tell you what type of job you're going to get. And then usually it's attached to money and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. So it's like, it makes complete sense that many of us are still trying to figure this out and maybe struggle with it on and off or all the time, myself included, because we've been conditioned to feel and think and be that way. And constantly doing, right? So like one of the things I kept thinking about is like, yep, I reached that goal. Well, now I got to set another one, right? And then I got to set another one. And then I got to set, and it's like, well, when is enough sort of thing? Though at the same time, finding a harmony to like resting is something that's necessary, but when am I also just not growing, right? Like going back to that idea of like, there's some sort of movement in growing, though a lot of growth can happen in rest and stillness. In fact, like that's where a lot, like that's why sleep is so important, right? Is that a lot of like repair is happening during sleep. I'm currently training for a marathon right now, and I'm very much physically realizing the amount of like rest and recovery and how that's so important for the actual like building of strength and endurance and capacity. And so you can't you'll get injured, right? Like if you don't have some sort of rest and recovery as well. So looking at that as a necessary component to continue growing and moving in whatever direction you're going in.
Yeah, but on the flip side of that too, like is you need like the rest needs to be from something, right? Like training for the marathon. I'm training for a half marathon right now, so similar, right? And like the rest is important after a workout. Like if I didn't do the workout, then like I don't need to rest. And I think it's that balance, like you talked about, like you said, of like you need both. You can't just be doing either one, even though both are important. And I think it's easy to fall into like, we live in a capitalist society, right? Like we all live in America. Most of our listeners live in America. Like we live in a capitalist world where you are judged by your output. You are judged by your income. You're judged by your net worth. You're judged by all of these things. And so it's easy to look at, if I'm not working, 60-hour weeks or 70-hour weeks or more than that, like, well, then I don't really care about my job, or I don't really care about my career, something like that. And that is so easy to fall into that kind of like workaholic world where there's no, then you're not resting. You're not actually growing from that. And then I think often like I see the pushback of that is like, no, just like slack off. Like your job's not going to care. Like your job doesn't notice. You work at a corporation. They don't notice your output. It's too big.
Quiet quitting.
Yeah, right. And like all of these things where that's the flip side, where it's like, oh, now you're only resting. You're not growing from that rest because it's all you're doing. And so you need that balance of like, just like with training for a marathon, like you need to rest, but you need to have gone for the run first, right? Like you can't just sleep 12 hours and call that the day, right? Like you
Totally.
need both.
Totally. And what really came to mind when you were talking about that was the power and like the importance, from my opinion and perspective, of really taking the time to understand what like you as an individual like value and what's important to you. And one of the things that I for years now have just felt like should be like a government system is that when you leave college you should be able to work with like a professional coach, like some of the things that I do,
Mhm.
because that's such a pivotal time where you're like, I don't know what to do, right? Like I've been in this very highly structured environment. Even if I like went away for college and like was living on campus, still very structured. Like you're told where to be and you're told what to do, to then being like completely
Mhm.
like out on your own. And that's really scary and overwhelming. And like, of course,
Yeah.
many of us feel lost. And then it's like, there's some real things like I got to pay bills now. And so now I'm taking a job just because I need to do this. And we're never given the space to like kind of stop and go, okay, what is important to me? What are my strengths, right? How can I align what's
Mhm.
important to me and my strengths together? What am I interested in? How can those be aligned to move forward? And then how do I work towards that? Because I do think like this idea of like quiet quitting and what's been it's been happening pre-pandemic was like, before the pandemic we had the World Health Organization said that the US had a burnout problem, and it was mostly around in lack of
Mhm.
engagement, right? So going on this like rest thing is, sometimes people say they're resting but really they're in, and I'm not going to say they're depressed, but they're in a depressive state because they don't feel motivated and engaged and excited by what they're doing. Some of it can also feel because they're really frustrated they're not being valued for like what they bring to the table. And this doesn't even have to be in the workplace, it can be with family, friendships, significant others, all of that. And so really the beginning part is being clear on like, who am I? What do I value? What do I want? What am I curious about? And
Mm.
how can I make steps slowly over time to bring those together? Because then you become stronger as like, I get this like image of a tree, right? You become the like rooted tree, and you can be blowing in the wind
Mhm.
at times, but you're not going to snap. And things like people being like, oh wow, like you don't make enough money, okay great, but I'm actually doing something I really enjoy. Or oh wow, you like,
Mm.
you're not at this level yet of your job, or like whatever, like all these kind of superficial things that we attach a lot of worth to that really mean nothing, right? Like we have a better, I don't want to use the word armor, but like a stronger root of going, those things aren't as important to me anymore because I'm actually more in aligned with who I am. And so I'm living a more fulfilling, satisfying life, right? Like there's so much research out there that just because you're making a ton of money doesn't mean that you actually feel fulfilled or connected or feel satisfied.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it can be like you happen to be good at something that's valued by our society from a monetary sense, but it doesn't mean it's something that means anything to you. Or maybe it is something that encourages unhealthy behavior patterns or unhealthy time management patterns or something. And I mean, so often it's like people are working 80 hours a week and making a ton of money and by all accounts successful, but they're like, I miss my family so much. Like, I would love to just have a weekend with my child or with my spouse or with my whole family or whatever. And so I absolutely agree that by diving in and getting a little bit, a lot more in tune with your own values and like strengths and desires and fulfillment objectives, in a sense, like you can lead a much more fulfilling life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Stephanie, you work with clients to talk about some of these questions, and that's where you have some background with that. When you start working with a client who maybe comes in and is not rooted, like doesn't know what their kind of North Star statement is, those sorts of things, where do you start? How do you go from someone that doesn't have those things to someone that is confident and not just has them written down somewhere, but someone that actually is able to like rely on that and lean on that so that when the world so to speak, the world tells them that, oh, you're not making enough money, that they can kind of clap back and say, I don't care. I don't want to make more money than this. I'm happy with where I'm at. How do you get to that point?
Yeah, great question. So there's a few different things I do. So the coach training program I went through, a school called IPEC, one of the reasons I chose to go there is that they teach their coaches a framework called the Core Energy Leadership Framework. And having done my second master's at Columbia and did stuff in the org psych program and things like that, I realized how important assessments were, mostly to like businesses and corporations. And I think we sometimes go overboard with them. But there is like, especially in coaching and like trying to measure our growth and see growth, that can be really intangible. And so I did want to go somewhere where there was an assessment that was connected to the framework that we were using. And so IPEC has this assessment called the Energy Leadership Index Assessment, which correlates with the type of like coaching we do. And the word energy, like for some people, they're kind of like, well, that sounds really woo-woo. And I'm like, totally get it. You can think of energy as like, they take that word out and you can look at it as like different perspectives or different lenses that I'm looking through. So I always start with clients, whether it's a one-to-one client or a team or a group that I'm working with, everyone taking that assessment. And what I really love about it, it's different than say like DISC and Enneagram and Myers-Briggs, where that's a personality assessment. So you're kind of like, you are a 4-6 or you are a this, right? And that's great, but it's also limited again. We're putting people into boxes, being like, this is what you are, and here's the good of it, and here's the bad of it. And you're like, great, so what do I do with this now? This assessment is an attitudinal assessment. And so what it's taking is a snapshot of how you are showing up currently in your life, internally and externally, through these 7 lenses. And it's showing you 2 different things. 1, how you're showing up on a good day. And then 2, how you show up when you go into your stress cycle. So for me, having done my thesis at Columbia in stress and how do we shift our relationship, I was like, this is perfect, right? Like this is like stress is kind of the underlying thing for everybody in some sort of way. And we actually do need stress in our life to be able to perform optimally, but finding your own sweet spot. So what this does is it gives my clients a snapshot of like, oh, okay, so here's where I'm at. And then we go through this debrief step by step. We talk about what that level is. We talk about how is it showing up. We talk about where is it serving them? When is it not serving them? And what that does is it opens them up to realizing, oh, I can be in these levels by choice rather than just by default. Because many of us are like just by default reacting to things, right? And so in order to create more agency in our life, we have to create more awareness. With more awareness, we see that there's more choices, and therefore we then have more power and agency. In order to do that, we have to slow down and pause. And instead of just react to things, which is what we do in the stress cycle and when we're living unconsciously, and instead we pause and we find ways to then decide from a place of empowerment how I want to respond to this thing. And we can go through like how that is a real like mind, body, spirit thing, in the sense that like the more that you choose to respond to things, you're actually creating different neural pathways. You can learn how to tap into your body and listen to your body, because your body actually knows things before your brain does, so many things like that. So I always start there. And by the end of that debrief, the client is sometimes a little overwhelmed by the amount of information, but there usually is something there that they're like, oh, I have felt really like, a lot of times they feel really validated by the actual like assessment anyways. And they're even in the levels that maybe feel not so good, but we always say there's not a good or a bad, nothing like energy or lenses are neither positive or negative. There's advantages and disadvantages to all of them. But it really it gives them this like almost like this relief that there's now a tangible framework that they can use as a tool when they're feeling something, thinking something, or noticing a behavior. Because that's the other thing. It's holistic in the sense that for every level, there's a core thought, a core emotion, and a core behavior or result, action or result. And then that becomes the foundation of all the coaching work we do. And so we bring it back, using it to help shift our lenses, right? Because when we think about stress, there's like the 3 S's of stress. Is like the stressor, which is a perceived threat. There's the stress reaction, which is fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And then there's the strain, which is the outcome. So the stressor, which is the perceived threat, if we can shift our perception to threat, and like what we think is threatening, we shift our relationship to stress. And we can do that at any part of the cycle. So from there, we then start like creating more awareness of like, well, where did that idea that like I have to be this way or I should be doing this come from? That then starts getting into deeper conversations around like me as my job of being a coach, mirroring back and being like, it sounds like you really, value community. Like you keep talking about this and all of that. And then the person be like, yeah, that actually is true. And then we'll do an exercise around like, well, what are maybe your top 2 or 3 values? How are you actually actioning that? In a corporate way, one of the biggest things I see is most businesses have a mission statement, right? They have a value statement. They have an out-facing one, and they usually have one internally, like the employee value proposition. And I'll say, okay, so now we know what your values are. What practices, what actions do you have in place that are putting those values into practice? And that's where a lot of times there's a disconnect. Whether it's a company, a team, or an individual is like, well, I value this and I value this and I value this. Okay, so what actions and behaviors are actually in alignment with that? And which actions and behaviors are in misalignment with that? Because once they're in misalignment, then we've created what we call distress, and that's the bad stress. And then that becomes an opportunity to say, okay, well, what do I have to shift? Maybe it's a value that maybe I thought I valued that, but I really didn't. Okay, cool. So what am I actually valuing, right? Or, oh, well, then I need to shift my actions in this way, or I need to shift my perspective or anything like that. And it's a continuous cycle or dance and movement of going in and out of awareness, action, and perspective shifting.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love the words you're using there, like shifting instead of like full change. Like shift feels much more manageable. I think that makes it a little bit easier to say like, okay, slight realignment here, because coming in and saying like you need to change this and change this and change that is going to be really daunting, and it's going to be really hard to actually implement that and stick to that. Whereas like shifting feels a lot more in line with building out your values, building out systems to support your values, or like you're saying, actions and behaviors that support those values, and then getting into alignment. Like what a beautiful picture. And also acknowledging it's not the easiest thing. Like it does take support and coaching and sometimes an outside perspective, like you're saying, or another lens to be able to see, well, internally I've been living this way and being in some dissonance, some distress even, and somebody else is able to come in and have that perspective of, yeah, you're saying you value whatever, but you are just like all of the behaviors and all the actions that are taking place are going directly against that. And how can we remaneuver and right ship a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I will say too, like one of the things, the biggest things that I've seen is the most powerful thing in coaching is just giving space for someone to share and having someone acknowledge and validate that what they're feeling and thinking and going through is true for them. Right? Like it's not my job to agree or disagree with anything that they're doing. Like that's not helpful. But I can acknowledge and validate that like that makes sense, that would feel really overwhelming, or it's understandable that you would feel frustrated given this situation, right? Like, and once we have someone like kind of acknowledge and validate that, there's so much more of a like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy, or I'm not blowing this out of proportion, or I'm not this or that, or like, you're not alone. That's the other big thing is like, we all live so much, myself included, up in this like head, right? And it's like, I'm the only one feeling and thinking this and stuff. And one of the things that I love about podcasts, and like I literally listen to so many of them, is that it's helping people to realize like they're not alone in certain things, right? And there's such an intimacy to
Absolutely.
it because most of us listen to them with headphones, so you're like literally in my ears, right? And there's this like connection and intimacy towards it that like, oh wow, someone else experiences something I have. Now the next step is to then be able to dialogue and actually create connection through that, because then we don't feel as isolated and alone. But yeah, so I think that is a big thing. And I love what you're saying about like the change can be really overwhelming, right? And so what can be really helpful to remember is that like it's these little things that we can do that as long as we stay committed to them and doing the work to understand what we really value and what's important to us helps us with the motivation to keep going. Because if we didn't do the work to know like why this is important to me and why I value all of that first and get really clear on that, then it's much easier for us to go, okay, like one thing goes wrong and we're like, ah, I'm done. It didn't work. Right. Which is really the aspect of resilience. And I would be curious, Joel, to hear about your training. And I've learned so much about myself through like training for half marathons and marathons, because there's so many times where I want to give up. And there's so many times where I'm like, I can't do this. And like times that I've pushed myself too much, times that I've just like given up on myself. And like, yes, like I work with a coach. I hired a coach this time around for the marathon, and like he can be really supportive and he can hold me accountable and he can like put together a great plan, but I still got to do it. Like he can't run it for me. And so like, you know, that aspect of it too is like no one can make these shifts for us except for us. So also owning and taking responsibility for that, and also taking responsibility when there's a time where it's like, you know what, I don't want to do that today. And that's fine. We don't need to feel shameful about that as well, right? We didn't fail if we like are choosing to go a different direction or we need a timeout or things like that. But yeah, I think that's one of like a big part of what I do with people as well, is in allowing them that space, right? To feel safe to bring all of that up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like that point that you brought up, that like working with a coach, like they can set up the strategy, they can put a framework in place, like as far as like a running plan, like yeah, they can tell you how much to run and when and how much to rest and all of those things, but they can't do the running for you. And just like working with like a coach in a different context, like a career coach or life coach or transitional coach, whatever you want to call it, like in whatever context, like they can help you with all of these things. Like they can set a framework in place, they can tell you what to do, they can do all of those things. They can't do it for you. Like I think when I was younger, I got caught up in a lot of that, like, oh, I would read these self-help books and I would read these books that like these nonfiction, and it was fascinating and I loved reading it, and you know, Atomic Habits and all these different things, and I was like, these are really great books, these are really interesting, like this is really cool. And then my life didn't change very much. I was like, I'm reading all these books, like why are things not changing? And it's because the actions that I was taking was to read the books and then live my life completely unrelated. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. It's like you can listen to as many podcasts as you want, you can read as many books as you want, you can be in therapy as much as you want. If you're not actually doing the work, like that's what matters. And like we talked a couple of weeks ago when we had Carter Kilman on this show, like we talked about all the frameworks to like for to-do lists, all the fancy, you know, softwares and frameworks and to-do lists and OKRs and KPIs and everything that you put in place and all of that. Like it's just there to get you to do the shit in front of you. Like that's all it is. It's just all this fancy stuff to force you to sit down and actually do the work or get up and actually go for the run. And like that's what it is. It's just a framework in place, but you still have to do the work on top of that. And if you're not doing the work on top of that, it doesn't matter how many frameworks you know if you don't do any of them. Like, and so anyway,
I totally hear that, because I mean, the amount of books that I've read that I'm like, this is gonna change my life, and I like finish it and I'm like, it is amazing. I tell everybody, and then I'm like, wait, why did I not change? It's almost like wait, I by sleeping on the book, it's not gonna just like come into my body and my brain.
Right.
I will say that what I think is really helpful and what I what I wanted to do when I made the stress management workbook is that there are so many different tools and frameworks out there. And what's great about that is like what works for you today may not work for you tomorrow, and that's okay. And what works for me may never work for you, and vice versa. And that's also okay. And so taking the time to really understand yourself and what motivates you, what helps you. And there's different types of motivations too, right? We talk a lot about extrinsic and intrinsic, but there's so many other in between there that like, and forgive me for always using running examples right now, but like the first time I ran a marathon, like it was very extrinsic. I wanted to be able to tell people I ran the New York City Marathon. I wanted that medal and all of that. But if it only stated an extrinsic motivation, there's no way I would have made it through training. There had to be some sort of intrinsic element of it, right? To be able to continue to do it. But then there were moments where it was like, okay, I mean, what I joke about all the time is when you're training for like a marathon or even a half marathon is like a practice in saying no to everything, because it's like, no, I can't go out on Friday night because I have to be up on Saturday morning to run 18 miles, right? Like, so no, I can't do that because I need to sleep more, or like, oh, I have to do that. Whatever it is, you're learning to say no a lot to be able to do this other thing. And that the motivation to do that may not be intrinsic or even extrinsic, but it's like aligned with what's value, like what I find as a value, right? So going back to those values, that it was, I knew why it was important for me to run the race the first time I did it. I had real reasons for it, and having to come back to my why and make these other decisions that were in alignment and integrated with that. But there's different ways to get there, right? So going back to like the different tools and stuff, when it comes to like stress or managing our stress or just shifting our mindset or things like that, like some days I'll use one tool that like helps me to shift my mindset, whereas the next day I can try using that tool like 4 or 5 times and it's not working. So I'm like, okay, great. What else can I go into my toolbox for and use a different one, right? So you like reading all those things and listening to all these things. Yes, we do have to put them into practice. And the more that we do that, the more we find ones that resonate with us, and the more that we can to draw on things when our go-tos aren't working, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like maybe we've talked about this on this show before. I don't know. I lose track. But we like the more actions that you take like towards the New York City Marathon, or towards like you're doing, what is it, the Berlin Marathon. Like the more actions you take towards that are the votes for your identity that you're like moving towards that. And it becomes easier and easier to make that a part of, oh, this is a value that I live out. It's not choices that I'm making right now. It's just the habit. That's the person that I am. No, I'm a runner, so I'm not going to go out and, have 3 cheeseburgers and, 2 bags of fries tonight, because I'm getting up tomorrow morning and going for a run. And I'm going to feel like garbage if that's what I do. Right. And so, and it's not like meant to be a restrictive thing. It's just, that's the person that I am right now. Like that's the decisions that I'm making, because that's the identity that I have in this season because of all the votes that I'm casting for it. Like I'm just going to keep doing that. So
I love that you use the word seasons. I had a client in one of my group coaching groups, a lot of the word group there. And we were going through something, this was like a year ago. And she was like, I keep reminding myself that like, there are different seasons, and this is just the season I'm in, right? So this, like, sometimes we feel really stuck in certain things, or maybe we feel really lost, or maybe things like that. And reminding ourselves that like, we are just like nature, and we're growing and evolving, and things are dying and releasing to make for the new and stuff. And so like, this is just the season I'm in. Nothing is permanent. It's all temporary. And that was like such a gift to get from a client, to be like, this is so true. Like, this is the season I'm in. And it's okay to shift to another season. And it doesn't mean that you've changed as like a person when all of a sudden you're shifting priorities into some other part of your identity of who you are. It's just a different version of you, but not like, because I think some people sometimes are like, or at least I'll speak from an I perspective, like I can get really into running, and then I'll be like, okay, but now I'm going to focus on this other thing, and maybe I don't run as much anymore, right? And I've had issues where I'm like, well, then I'm not really a runner because I don't do it. And it's like, no, that was my priority there. I was in that season. Now I want to shift over and do this because I'm curious about this, and I'm going to lean into that. But with that also comes a little bit of grief because we are leaving behind a part of ourselves, right? And that grief is okay, and that we all are grieving something at some point in time. Like, that's just a part of being human. I don't think we talk about grief enough, actually. And this idea that like we're always processing that, and then it's not linear, and it doesn't need to be something bad happened to you. Like when I left my full-time job to start my business, I was really excited to leave and build out this business. I was also really sad to leave my full-time job. It's not like I hated the people. It's not like I hated what I was doing. I just knew it was time to move on. And I still grieve some of that sometimes. And like, that's okay.
Yeah, it's really cool to like live life in the bittersweet, and it's hard to swallow sometimes because we're not that good at talking about grief, and we're not that good at thinking about it. But most most doors closing are another opening, and most doors opening are closing something else, and that is both beautiful and heartbreaking and really exciting and really sad, and I think also very inevitable. Like you aren't going to have the exact same interests that you did when you were 4, even though like trains were really cool when I was 4, but they're just not the same way to me at this point. I'm not in my train season anymore. We bash on media quite a bit in this podcast, but I think something that I really like that's been going around on Twitter for the past few months is just like the eras idea. It's like I'm in my Taylor Swift era, I'm in my this era, and like I think that does really align with you know, this summer was a time of whatever interest, and I was really into this type of music, and I'm not anymore. But that doesn't mean I hate it, and that also means like I experienced that, and I leaned into it when I loved it, and I love something else now, and that's an exciting thing and a bittersweet thing.
You know what? So it's so funny. I love that too. Like I'm in this era, I'm in that era. Is like in order to when we go back to like goals and growing, in order for us to reach goals and continue to grow, we literally outgrow things, right? Like you're also not wearing the same clothes you wore when you were 4, you know, like we literally outgrow it.
Right.
But what we forget about is that like that also has to do with workplaces, relationships, like thought processes that we have. Like, so going back to the energy leadership framework, the like beliefs and ideas that we had is what got us to where we are now. But those same ones might not be the ones that get us to where we want to be. Right? Like they actually could continue to hold us back. It got us to where we are now, but they could keep us where we are now. And so as painful as it is to release those things, it's necessary in order to continue to grow and evolve. And going back to trees, because clearly I'm into trees right now. But I don't know if you guys know what Shinroku is. It's forest bathing. It's a really interesting thing. And I did it a couple years ago. And basically it's like just being one with trees and nature and stuff. So there's a little like kind of hippiness to it. But what I really like, what really
solidified, that's okay.
Great. What really solidified for me,
Stephanie and her trees era.
Exactly. What was really solidifying for me when I was doing this, and you do it with like a guide and everything, was that the guide was telling us like the leaves have to fall off, right, in order for new ones to come. Right. Like, and we go back to seasons, like, especially if you're in like New England area, which is where I grew up, was in New England, is like, we have to go through fall and things need to die and like go away to be literally like barren and naked and then freeze, right? Because that's our hibernation place, in order to allow for things to bud again. But it's like those little buds, they can be painful just the same way as like losing something can be painful. Though how can we continue to like have grace and compassion with ourselves as we're going through those dark places, right? Like the winter, to be able to emerge again as the thing that we're trying to grow into. And so that I think is also something that like I'm continuously reminding myself of, like, wow, like some of the friendships I've had or some of the relationships I've had, like when we hold on to it, right, or we attach too much to it, like we're actually not growing. We're staying stagnant. And that it doesn't mean that we don't care about the person or that didn't mean anything to us or anything like that, but things need to fall away for us to be able to get to where we are. And I had a friend say to me one time, like, yeah, you've been really trying to up level your life in so many different ways. Of course, the other stuff has got to fall away because you no longer are in that, you're not in that era anymore. You're in this other one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. We talk, I mean, this show's becoming ourselves, right? And we talk about kind of this like adult adolescence life stage of being a young adult. And there's so many things to explore. Like a lot of our audiences in their like 18 to 34, sort of this young
Era.
adult, era, where there is so much like young adulthood is full of that, like, I'm not a kid anymore. Like, I got to figure out how to pay my bills. I got to figure out like, where do I want to live? I got to figure out like what do I want to do with my career? I got to figure out like, what does a life partner look like? Is that something I'm interested in? Like, maybe I like this person a lot, but are they really like the one that I want to be with forever? Like, those are like a lot of those questions. And I think that comes with that we should talk about more, that we haven't as much, is the like the grief for the life stages that we're moving out of. That, exactly like you're saying, there's so much excitement for what's ahead, and there's so much excitement for whatever life stage you're in, right? You don't have to be in your 20s for that to be true, but whatever life stage you're in, there's so much excitement in front, and there's so many great things ahead of us. Like, our best days are ahead of us. Like, our best days are coming. And with that, we're leaving some great days behind too. And that there is this give and take, that living in the bittersweet of, no, it doesn't have to be all sweet, and that doesn't have to be all bitter either. But there is this joy and pain, that tug and toll of there's both, and there will always be both. And even in great seasons, even in our best eras, like, there's sadness there, and there's loss, and there's grief to go with that. And yeah, I think we societally have lived through a lot of shit in the last like 4 years, and there's a lot of obvious grief that comes with that, but also there's like I had a lot of ignorance pre-pandemic. I still have a lot of ignorance, but like pre-pandemic, like there was a lot of like clinging to the status quo that I was like, nah, stuff's impossible. Like, these are things that'll never change, and then it all changed. And I think there's like even in the happiness that has come from that, there's a grief that comes with that too, and there's a mourning for what was, even though I'm happier with what is, even though there's like great things ahead, even though there's excitement for today, there's excitement for tomorrow, this season of life. There also is a deep sadness for the season of life that's past, and I think that's always true regardless of what's going on. I don't think you're ever going to escape both of those.
Well, and I want to jump off that too, Joel, is like this sadness feeds the happiness, and the happiness feeds the sadness, because you don't want a monotone. You don't want to, like, if you're always at a state of perpetual maximum joy, you aren't actually, because you're not having any changes. And I'm thinking about, like, I'm a musician, and I like have done a lot of piano things, and you don't want something that's just all pure major chords without any dissonance. The most satisfying and beautiful and incredible concertos and pieces and compositions and moments and pieces are when there's a big, dramatic, painful clash that then turns into something all the more satisfying. But it's earned, right? And so those grieving eras and those like losing and hurting from change is what also feeds being so happy and being able to find so much joy in the next great thing that lies ahead.
I was going to say something so similar, and you just said that in such a more poetically beautiful way. Yes, that's so true. I think of it as like peaks and valleys, and like, and textures and colors, and like they're all there, right? When we think about emotions. And I think sometimes our society labels emotions as like good or bad, when really emotions are neither positive or negative. We attach meaning to them. They're just energy and motion is what I say. Like they're energy and motion. And when we're not feeling them, they get stuck and then they're not moving, right? And so the more that we can feel and lean into them, we get those colors, we get the different sounds, we get all of that. And it becomes a more beautiful, full, rich life of being a human being. Like that's what it means to be human.
Yeah.
I think about one of our other brothers is a therapist, and I, like, 4 or 5 years ago was talking to him like pretty regularly. Like, I'm not feeling good. I'm really sad. I'm really hurt. I'm really angry. I'm really upset. I'm really frustrated. All these emotions that we do tend to tag as negative. And he would always just like, yeah, but you're feeling those things. Like that was what he always came back to me with. And at first it was annoying, right? I was like, but they're sad. I don't like them. And it switched to being a really empowering thing when I started to think about it and understand it more, of like, I am feeling those things and they're strong emotions. And what a great thing to be able to feel strong emotions and not have to tag them as like amazing or terrible. But I was like, wow, I really am feeling a lot of things. And as I started to embrace that, started to have a better relationship with the negatives as well as the perceived negatives and the grief and the loss and everything, as well as being able to enjoy the positives and the happiness and the valleys and the peaks all the more, right?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. They're just more information for ourselves. So it's like if we stop having information, then we don't even know where to go next, right? So emotions, if we look at them as information of things to learn more about ourselves, like when we're feeling frustrated and sad and angry, it's like, okay, well, what's underneath that, right? Like what is that bringing that up? Maybe it's I'm not doing something I really want to do, or I'm not being seen the way I want to be seen. Well, how can I do that, right? And that actually being numb is just avoiding. And that's actually that means you're constantly in some ways in your stress cycle, because you're just freezing or running away from something, as opposed to like sometimes when I'm working with people that are really at kind of those like lower energy levels, I'm really trying to get them to a place where they want to fight, right? Because that actually gives a little more agency. It's like, well, I got to fight for myself. Okay, well, that's a lot better than you being like, no, what's the point? Blah, blah, blah. And then we've got some stuff to work. Things are moving through. Okay, so what are we fighting for? And why is this important? And then we can start transitioning that into something that's not coming from like a resentment or a territorial thing or things like that, into, oh, now we know what your values are. We've uncovered those little gems, right? And now how can we shift it that we're working with them, right? And in alignment with them. So yeah, I love that. And on the flip side, these positive emotions that we always talk about, like you always have to be positive or think positively or this or this or that, that can actually go very quickly into toxic positivity, or in the spiritual world, we call it spiritual bypassing, which is another form of just numbing and not actually engaging in the work. Because the work is not always easy, comfortable, and all of that. It's usually uncomfortable. And then, of course, I always think of the movie Inside Out, which I think is such a wonderful, like, 101 on, like, how to name your emotions.
Man, I love it. I almost quoted The Incredibles earlier, too. That's great. We're really calling out Pixar right now. Old Pixar, but yeah. That's great. Well, Stephanie, I do want to be like appreciative of time and like respectful to you and to ourselves and to our listeners. And so I think we should transition and actually start to talk about this stuff on the show sheet now. No, I'm kidding. This has been such a good conversation, Stephanie. We'll have to do it again and get to the questions that we prepared. But this has been lovely. This has been a wonderful conversation. Before we kind of start to close out, do you have anything else that you would like to touch on before we kind of move into a closing?
I don't think so. This was great. I loved having this conversation. And I think it's funny that we were like, yeah, these questions are great, but let's see what happens. And we literally like threw the format and like, here we are, which is great. I think this is exactly the type of thing that I hope more people are doing, right? Whether it's like listening to this conversation on the podcast and then being like, I'm going to like ask my friend about something, or like maybe we can talk about this, and inspire people to get out of their own head and have conversation with other people, because we're also not meant to do this alone. Like, that's the other thing, is like, we're not meant to figure it out on our own. And though we are like the expert in ourselves, like we sometimes need other people to mirror back with us, ask us questions, things like that, so that we can actually become the full version of ourselves, right? And we need others to be able to do that.
Absolutely. 100%. Yes, for anyone that needs somebody to talk to, you can always text us, this podcast, at 503-893-2664. And we always respond. You're not alone. There's a lot of people going through stuff that you're going through. Man, I said a lot of words right there that didn't fit, but that's okay.
I love it.
Yeah. Thank you for tuning in. Stephanie, for people that want to find more of you, how can people find more of you?
Sure. So I'm on Facebook, because I'm older and that's still a thing for some people. Instagram and LinkedIn, and all of those are just at Stephanie Simpson Coaching. I do have a website, which is stephanie-simpson.com, which hopefully in the next couple of months we'll be getting a makeover. But there is a website there that people can go and connect with me there, or they can just send me a message on LinkedIn and Instagram. I'm on more often than Facebook, but I'd love to hear from people.
Plus, they can read 21 Days Stress Management Workbook. A holistic interactive guide to redefining a relationship to stress.
That's right. They can reach out and I can tell them how they can get access to that.
Absolutely. Well, we will link all of those in the description as per usual, so that they'll be easy to find. The idea is that if you listen to this podcast and you want to find more of Stephanie, it's easy to do. We'll make it as easy for you as possible. So thank you so much for tuning in. Stephanie, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your whatever day this is evening, and taking the time to record and have this conversation. This has been really lovely, and I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Yeah.